Is Representative Pearl on site?
No.
I've seen him, so.
I have not seen him.
All right.
And I haven't seen,
No, he's not coming today, I don't reckon.
Okay.
you don't reckon?
Why don't we,
I don't believe it.
why don't we get started with H368? We have Abby Willard joining us this morning from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
Yeah, good morning. Yeah, for the record, Abby Willard, Agency of Ag. So H368, I would say I actually am curious to hear a little bit from the committee, kind of what your vision was and your intent, what you're hoping to achieve. I do have some data to share. I'm happy to talk about our reactions to it, but I want to make sure I understand first what your objectives were.
So, do you want to speak to that, Representative Brown?
Sure. So 368 was created with the understanding that farmers are aging in Vermont. The average age of a Vermont farmer is 57. 30% of Vermont's ag land is owned by those above the retirement age. And we really need to start thinking about those land transitions. And one of the biggest barriers that I'm hearing from young farmers is that they cannot access land, nor can they access capital. And so this was supposed to be just that bridge and that starting conversation for how do we connect folks who want to engage in the working lands businesses, but who are clearly struggling to get there on their own, and how do we meet that need of acknowledging we're about to have a large number of our population going out of agriculture and going out of those businesses. So how do we link that?
Right. That's helpful.
Can I add something, Chair?
I'm sorry, yes.
And we met with Michael O'Grady from Ledge Council, and the one thing he kept saying was, we have to have data to prove that these folks have been disadvantaged. And that's the one thing that we don't seem to have, and so we're trying to fill in the gaps and say, if he said, if you can show how many female loan applicants for buying a farm have been denied versus how many male applicants, then we might have something to work with. But we can't just categorically say, you can all disadvantage folks. We have to prove that they've been disadvantaged and there's been harm in some way.
And that they have not been receiving grant awards
Exactly.
currently.
Right.
Okay. Were you imagining that this, increased authority and power of the Working Lands Board would mean that grants would go towards purchasing farms and purchasing land? Was that sort of an implied focus of this additional charge?
That the Working Lands Board would be purchasing farms?
The Working Lands Board would be funding proposals around purchasing farms and purchasing land.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
No, that wasn't the intent. I think with the current powers and duties that exist with the Working Lands Board, you have the opportunity to work with other professional stakeholders that are involved in those type of land acquisitions. And I think that Working Lands just seemed like the really good middle ground for being able to start those conversations.
Okay.
But yeah, this is very early stages development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then was the vision that this would be prioritizing businesses that had never previously farmed? So I know it has like a definition of a new farmer, which is not that, but then there was also language that says, increasing assistance for more persons to enter farming in the state. So I was just curious if that was, you were looking for like all new, or it really was no more than 3 years of the last 10 were engaged in farming.
No, and not entirely new. And we had this conversation in the committee, that we want folks who are clearly demonstrated that they are engaged in agriculture within the state and who are looking to really pursue this as their career.
Okay. And then I think the last question was like around the median income. So just trying to think about so 50%, the median income threshold represents about half of the Vermont population. So that's a pretty open target. And was that intentional?
Well,
No.
no, yeah, the challenge we ran up against was we actually wanted to carve that out to really clearly define who we thought in our minds were disadvantaged. But we ran up against the issues of it being unconstitutional and not being able to put in the protected classes that we wanted to see. And
Yep.
so the state median income was the solution that we were offered by legislative council.
Okay.
But it does not in any way narrowly define who we would actually like to see prioritized in this.
Would it be fair to call it a placeholder at this point?
Absolutely.
Representative Templeman.
Just kind of curious about process here. In this situation where you're trying to do this for a certain group of people, but now it seems like we need to define who that group is, would the right way to be moving forward would be like to issue forth a study to indicate who those people are? I mean, or is that too long and arduous?
I mean, I think we know who those people are. I think that
I need
there's,
to prove who those people are. I guess it's
Right.
proof,
I think it's data collection.
right? Like, so who does that?
Well, that's, we're gonna say.
Well, we could, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you're
Okay.
asking.
Does that give you enough of a sense of the intent?
Yeah.
And I guess it's fair to say that the bill as drafted doesn't exactly match perhaps the intent that the sponsors were looking for, as we just discussed in the, the way the median income is being used as a placeholder for disadvantage.
Yeah.
And one thing Mike O'Grady said was, moving forward, it could be something that is added to grant applications, which is gender, race identity, because right now it isn't. And he said if you added that, then you could track things.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that he offered. So I don't know what kind of data you have on this without having collected that previously. So
Yeah, so I'm happy to share what we have
That'd be
and what we currently do, and then some of the exciting kind of suggestions that, or I wouldn't even say they're suggestions, some of the upcoming activities that'll happen in next fiscal year. So I think that could help.
You start, Representative.
Yeah, please.
So I just wondered, sort of internally at the agency, where is the agency at with this data of like, okay, we have an aging farming population, farmers are trying to retire, want to retire, can't figure out succession, all that stuff. So sort of policy-wise, what's happening in the agency? And then the other piece that I keep thinking about is that the sort of tax requirements for being a farmer seem unrealistic to what's happening on farms these days, where so many farmers have to have a job off farm to support their farm habit. And so, the RAPs seem a little more consistent, but the IRS definition of having to make 50% of your income in the farm seems like a threshold that doesn't work for a lot of farms, at least a lot of farms I know. You'll have one person, as a married, filing jointly kind of thing. It must get into disqualifying you in some ways so that you're not eligible for a lot of agricultural type grants.
So yeah, maybe I'll start with the second one, your second question first. So I think actually the definition that we use for farming is this, generating $2,000 of income from a farming venture, which feels like a pretty low entry.
One's really low, one's really high.
Right, so we don't have control over what the Department of Tax kind of definitions are, but I think the programs that the Agency of Agriculture runs are pretty wide open to any individual that's, early stage in a business, maybe even is just kind of making that step from hobby to it being more than just feeding their family and themselves or their neighbors. So I haven't experienced that the ineligibility based on sales being too much of a barrier. I think there's plenty of conversation that we could have around when a business is diversifying and looking at other regulatory challenges that they face, which is kind of around the accessory on-farm business conversation, which I hope that we take that up at some point, sometime, because I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there to kind of help these ag businesses diversify and potentially ease into a diversified option that doesn't require an Act 250 review, for example, on a small parcel or a small operation. But again, maybe you're hearing something different, Representative O'Brien, around kind of the threshold of eligible entry to being defined as a
Well,
farm.
like NRCS type things, do those generally defer to IRS requirements for farm?
I don't know how, I honestly, yeah,
I got one right, but you're not.
Yeah, like- No, it wasn't 10 grand. That's what I found out yesterday.
Oh,
And it is income based. The grant was. So I don't know if that's across the board, but we got a grant for them to deal with invasives.
no,
And it was income, that's why my partner did it, because she's retired, so, yeah.
she had the time to do the application.
And she has, although I should have done it because I work here.
Representative O'Brien, did you get your,
And then the first one.
So then the first question, sort of around like our agency's policy regarding succession planning, I would say we're also aware of kind of like the aging, average age of a Vermont farmer, and concerned about that acreage of being at risk for not being transitioned into or remaining in agriculture. I would say most of the development programs that we run, primarily through Working Lands or Dairy Business Innovation Center, are primarily focused on how do we help a business either diversify, innovate, grow, or transition in some form. We've been really cautious as an agency of telling people what they need to transition or succeed into or how they need to do that, but more just providing the support, financial support through grant opportunities to do that, or connecting them to other resources that are very specifically focused on succession planning. So a lot of the business advisors, like at the Intervale Center or through Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, they are particularly focused on succession planning for businesses. And so we oftentimes pair grantees or applicants up with that business advisor to have more of that kind of succession conversation. We're not business planners at the agency, so we're not providing that kind of real one-on-one business technical assistance around how to succeed their business to the next generation or to a new buyer.
all set, John? Representative Lipsky and then Representative Rice. Jed, you're up.
Thank you. You know, it took me 15 minutes to actually get the bill in front of me. I apologize. But when I'm listening to the discussion, I'm going back over the last 3 months of testimony. And whether it's rights and democracy or other disadvantaged community or just young farmers that want an opportunity to be something other than a sharecropper or a tenant farmer. They want ownership and equity. And that struck me as an important goal over the last few months when we took testimony. Is that really the goal, one of a primary goal of this bill?
Who are you asking?
Heather.
The sponsor
Okay,
or counsel, or is that an inappropriate?
well, I think we just want to bear in mind that we've got a witness and the witness chair, so we should try to just use our time here to get, we can have that conversation, but just to be, I think the short answer is yes, not necessarily explicitly in the language of the bill, but that's,
One of the goals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but
Thank you.
yeah, Representative Rice.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of name because came to mind when you were saying the sort of goal of keeping this land in agriculture, right? And that's a shared goal, obviously. That's one of the sort of crises we see. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, all of this, the farmers are aging out, the land is coming out, there's no transition plan, we want to keep it in agriculture. But I think it's also important to name, and I think part of what this bill is trying to get at is that there are also sort of multiple ways in which it could stay in agriculture. And one of those is through consolidation and bigger farms. And that doesn't help solve the problem of access to land for young farmers without capital.
New farmers.
And so that's sort of, I think that's just an important
Yeah.
sort of
Actually,
name in this conversation.
Representative Templeman, did you have a hand up?
yeah, it was about that conversation.
Okay.
So I relent.
Representative O'Brien.
So, that 30 by 30 bill, we heard a lot of testimony about how Vermont's losing, I think, 12,000 acres of forest land a year. Is there any data on how many acres, if any, we're losing of farmland a year?
Yeah, we do. And I didn't bring that, and I may have it in my binder, but I think it's like 23,000 acres has been lost in agricultural production. I'll have to send you over the statistic just to confirm that, in the last like 20 years. So yes, we are losing agricultural land to being engaged in ag production, for sure. It's not maybe as much as we might fear, but it has happened. That's, yes.
Is that USDA data as well?
Yeah, again, I'll have to pull it up. Ryan Patch pulled it for me because we had the same question of like, how much are we losing? And he was like, here's the data. So he has two charts that can answer your question.
Just to clarify, and that's not necessarily one that's been developed permanently lost, or it is.
I think it's a combination probably of different uses. Some of it,
For example, taken out of use
yes.
and turned back to forest again would be included
I
in
think
that?
that could be one of the
Okay.
uses, yeah, but again, we'll have to look at that data. I'm sorry that I can't recall it exactly.
Representative Templeman?
No, that was it.
Okay.
Clarification.
Representative Lipsky?
Yeah, do we know if it's conversion to other uses other than just abandoned? Meaning, if you drive over to Chittenden County and you look left and right, but Williston exit and exit 14, there's a lot of, look like formerly open farmland they're big buildings being built, commercial buildings, not even some residential. I call that conversion to some other usage.
What she just said is it's a combination.
I think my recollection is that it's a combination of land that's been converted to development, land that's like fallow and now grown back up into a forested landscape, yeah.
Oh, I'm just curious if you have any data specifically about what this bill is addressing in terms of people, disadvantaged folks, BIPOC folks, women who have applied for grants and not gotten them. Do you have data for that, or is that something we have to build up?
Right, so that is not data that we have collected.
Okay.
So I think it says since, and I'm gonna send this to you, but since 1987, Vermont has lost 32% of our total cropland.
Wow.
And then there's, the use value appraisal program has shown that ag enrollment has decreased by 3,842 enrolled ag acres since 2018. At the same time, we've seen forest acres have increased in enrollment during the same time period.
Oh, that's interesting.
So again, I think there's probably, again, this is where it's a conversion issue, it's a land use change and, probably additional factors.
It was 30-something percent, was the
32.
32% since 1987.
that feels like an entirely different scale from 3,000 acres, and it seems like different timeframes, but
It might be 130,000 acres.
And it's
Yeah.
cropland, yeah.
Total cropland, yeah. So in 1987, we had 5,877 farms. In 2007, so this would be USDA NAS Ag Census data. There was 6,808 farms. So an increase in the number of farms. The ag the acres of land managed by farms in 1987 was 1.4 million, and in 2017 was 1.19 million. So that's where we lost about 200,000 acres of land. And the total cropland was in 1987, 707,970 acres. And in 2017, it was 479,680. Again, that's a lot of numbers that I just shared that I can't show you in the chart, but I'm happy to forward it to you or forward it to Laura and she can share it.
So,
So the data, should we chat about that?
yeah, and just before we do, I wanted to just clarify too, the agency does have data on ages of people who are farming now.
No. Our grantees,
Not grantees specifically, but just anybody who's engaged in farming.
Demographic.
yeah, I mean, that's not data that we collect, but we are utilizing census data, which is the same that, Representative Supernaut's referencing of the average age is 57 years old. So that's not data that we collect currently. But I do want to talk about what we have imagined for next fiscal year. But before I do that, I want to tell you the data that we do have, because there's a lot of data that we don't yet have. So the data that we do have for the Working Lands Program, which I think feels relevant to H368, is we do ask both applicants and grantees what stage of development their business is in. So that's the handout that was uploaded for you all. So, because I think this is where the definitions matter and how we're defining stages of business development matters. And so between fiscal year 19 and 23, 22% of the business grants that the Working Lands Program awarded went to what we would call, new farmers. And we're defining new farmers, if you're looking at that stage of development, business development handout, from pre-venture through seed stage, startup stage, and early stage. So again, those are 4 different categories of business development. And in the last, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, so 5 years of Working Lands business investments, 22% of those grantees have been in those 4 categories. 50% have been in the growth stage. So 69 out of the 126 farms or businesses that were awarded were what was captured in the growth stage, which is the next stage. And then there were, a few in maturity and few in this revitalization category. So again, let's review the 4 that we considered new farmers. So pre-venture stage means that they're planning and researching, to be a business or to reach markets or to start a new production. Seed stage is that they're still just at the thought of an idea, and they're still trying to figure out market opportunities. Startup stage would be they're in the initial stages of their operation. So they are starting to produce or they're starting to grow. Early stage is being defined as, break-even sales targets. So that means that they're now a business that can show that they are working towards profitability. And then a growth stage would be they've become profitable and they may even be looking at expanding their business.
Representative O'Brien?
Do you do any scale on these? Because, it'd be a big difference if you're I'm gonna go into, have a 500 goat dairy versus I'm gonna go from 1 Jersey cow to 2.
So the stage of business development is a question that the applicant answers in their application. So they are self-attesting to what stage of development they see their own business in. So they could be a goat dairy that would say they're in growth stage because they're going to now start making cheese. Or they could be a goat dairy that has 500 goats that needs an additional barn, and they could say they're in the maturity stage. But that's their decision to classify themselves based upon how they view their business.
Right. So I get that, but as far as the sort of potential gross income, do you sort of look at that and say, well, this is, a mom and pop shop versus this is a mini Hannaford's? I mean, they could both be at that same growth stage, but as far as the amount of money involved potentially, or, income
Yeah, so we're not using that we're not taking that information to make a determination around what stage of business they are. So
Right.
whether they're a new farm or an established business, we do take into effect as part of a working land application, we do look at their financial statements. We ask them to tell us if they currently have an accounting system. So we ask a variety of other questions around how do they manage their business? How established are they? So that we're making kind of a risk assessment and a viability determination as best we can from the information that they include in their application. So yeah, that's where sometimes we see, very modest income, but a really great balance sheet, or their profit and loss statement looks really good and they provide that information to us. That's very helpful information in determining that, yes, they might be in the, early stage of their business, but they clearly are selling product. They know their customer desires and they, have good market access. We could see a very leveraged, very large business that's applying that has, a lot of asset and significant amount of infrastructure, but, maybe not the best balance sheet when we're looking at that. So we see all kinds of businesses in lots of different scenarios and situations. And that's part of the application process. So that's like the pretty standard part of our grants, of our working lands grant process, is to have taken into consideration all of those bits of detail to make a determination of how viable is the business, how likely are they to be successful, how much do they actually need these grant funds for the project to be successful. Or could they do it on their own? Do they actually need this cash infusion of taxpayer dollars to do the work? Or could they do it on their own? So those are all the decisions. Yeah, we ask number of employees. So for the Working Lands program, the metrics of growth and impact that we collect are how many acres are currently in production and how many are either going to be retained, not lost, or additional acres gained as a part of this project. How many employees do you currently employ, and then how many will be retained or expanded as a result of this project? Look at gross sales. So tell us what your current gross sales are and what your projected gross sales are. So what that increase is. And for some reason I was thinking there was a fourth, but maybe those are the three that Working Lands captures.
Representative Rice.
So the self-attestation of what stage of business
Yep.
is data that you're just collecting as sort of demographic of the business. It's not going into the decision-making it's not sort of a factor.
Not really. It's really more just the business telling us where they see themselves. And then we can say, 22% are considered new businesses.
Which means that, so the weights that impact a decision of where the Working Lands grants are going to go, it seems like they're favoring the growth stage businesses.
It does.
Yeah.
Yep.
So one potential way to shift money to new farmers would be to shift those weights. Shift the sort of focus of Working Lands dollars to favor more the early stage, startup stage, seed stage businesses.
Well, actually, two things I was thinking about. What I didn't ask our team to collect is of the total applications that we receive, what percentage are in that new business versus growth stage. So it could be that we receive 5 times as many growth stage applications. And so we're funding, 50%, but those are the best ones. And we only get, a smaller percentage, a smaller number.
Higher ratio of the
Yes,
fund.
right. Or we may not, maybe the 22% of pre-venture through early stage grants that we're funding are 90% of the applicants that we receive.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, it would be helpful. And I've not pulled that number, but it's a good, they asked me, they're like, do you want grantees or applicants? I was like, I want grantees, but actually I think I want applicants too. Which I'm sure they can pull.
I think you want both, so.
We want both, right.
Answer there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, I was gonna ask, which was it again? Was it applications or?
These were
grants?
grantees.
Yeah, so the 22%, and what was the second number for the growth?
Then 54% of total business awards went to growth stage businesses.
So still actually more going to maturity, the mature and revitalization.
Yeah, 19 out of 126 went to maturity and 10 out of 126 went to revitalization. So I don't know what,
More than 20%.
yeah. Do you want to know those two numbers together? That kind of would be interesting. So let's say 29 of 126 is 23%.
Yeah.
That's the balance then.
Yeah.
Representative O'Brien?
I think you've given us this data before, but there's a certain, the other interesting thing would be to know how many of the applicants who did not become grantees reapplied with your help, because you said you work with them sometimes and that they become grantees later.
I don't know that number, but there are many.
Yeah.
Which I know this doesn't give you the answer that you're exactly looking for, but we see many repeat applicants in the Working Lands program. And what's challenging about that is it could be, they could be applying for the exact same project. But again, remember, we get $10 million in requests and we often have $1 million to grant out. Like that means there's a lot more that are not getting funded than those that are. The last couple of years, we've had, 3 million, 5 million to award, but still getting 10 million in requests, which means half of them we're not able to fund. So it could be that they had a perfectly good project and they were just below the threshold because we have to cut it off at some point. Or it could be that we gave them recommendation to make improvements to their application or work with a business planner and then return, or, be clear about your markets or what the impact will be on sales or employees or acres. And then they reapply with an improved application. That certainly happens also. Other times they return to us with the same application that's still not very high quality. And it's still not really very competitive. And we give them additional technical assistance and advice and feedback. We share all the reviewer comments back with the applicants that are not awarded grants, and as well as connecting them to resources or business planners or other funding opportunities. So sometimes they seek out those other funding opportunities and don't come back to us for that same project. Other times they find the other grants, but they come back to us 2 years later with another project. And sometimes we award it and sometimes we don't. It's really, again, this is where the program has been so well promoted and has had such recognition, but still so oversubscribed that it's really difficult to answer. I mean, again, I can get the answers to your questions, but it's really hard to know all the permutations of each applicant's kind of their path.
Representative Rice?
Is it possible to get more than one work for in multiple years? For
Yeah.
the same? So do
And that happens.
so somebody could come and be in the seed or startup stage, get a grant, 5 years later be in the growth stage.
Absolutely. Yeah, so we do in the eligibility of the grants say that if you, and it depends upon which grant funding opportunity you're applying for. If you're applying for one of the larger, industry impact awards, I think it's that you need to wait 3 years before you're eligible again to apply. For Working Lands, I think it's you just need to have completed your project to be eligible to apply again. So again, it kind of, which is related to the cap on the award. So if it's up to 35,000, you can apply again once your project is complete. If it's up to the $150,000 or $250,000 award, then you have to wait 3 years before you can apply
That's
again.
the industry impact is 150.
Yeah.
How many of those are?
How many of those are typically awarded? It's a good question. I won't be able to answer you exactly. Less than 20 a year. As right now we're making the decision on the ARPA awards that were up to 250,000. So that's the first time we've done that category of funding. And that was the primary producers. So we'll see, again, there's only $1 million. So I think it'll be, 7 or 8 awards. So to the question though of what data could we provide that we don't have? So we have a metrics team within the agency. So I would say we do not currently collect data, demographic data on if you're a veteran or if you're a disadvantaged farmer by the definition that is included in H368. We don't collect that data currently, but There's two additions that we have been working on and prepare to launch in July, so in fiscal year '24. And one is to add additional application information. So this would be for every applicant on the number of full-time employees, which we do collect, but adding the number of seasonal employees and whether they employ any foreign workers, the number of volunteer hours, the average hourly wage, whether they provide benefits to their employees, the years in operation of their farming business, and their annual operating budget. So that's data that we've not historically collected as demographic information from applicants. So that's exciting. I think that would address some of the pieces that you asked for: annual operating budget, years in operation, number of employees, benefits for employees all feel like starting to capture some of that data around disadvantaged. We're planning to do so if there's anything additional that you would be curious to have added to that, and that would be connected to the applicant's contact information. So we would know what farm has what annual operating budget, what farm has how many foreign workers, what farm has been in business for how many years. So it'll be very connected to the applicant and could be part of the applicant review process. The second piece of information that we want to collect is anonymous third-party voluntary information that would not be part of the applicant review. So this would be if you've had any grant writing experience and if you've worked with a technical service provider and who that is, what your primary spoken language is, your years of education and age, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, whether you're a veteran, or a person with disability. So that information will be captured, but not a part of their application and remain anonymous. But it will allow us to at least just share aggregate data on an annual basis of what we've received in applicants. We won't be able to tell you how many we've awarded in that category because we're not attaching that to the applicant's name. So we won't know whether we've awarded those females or those, veterans, but we'll know whether they've applied. And we'll be able to show a growth or a decline in that application pool over time.
If you made a request, I'm wondering whether, if it were in anyone's interest to actually be able to answer that question of how many disadvantaged farmers were awarded a grant or how many veterans, would it be possible to ask for the information collected on a voluntary basis? Is there a legal reason that?
Of awardees, are you saying of grantees?
Okay. Yeah. Is there a legal reason to have it be separated out and be anonymous?
This is where Steve Collier would be helpful. I know that when he's reviewed these various sets of demographic information, they were intentionally broken into these two categories of one that would be attached to the name and application and considered for review, and one that would be anonymous and not a part of the review process. I don't know if we could go back to grantees and ask them to voluntarily provide. Frankly, I'm not sure. We'd have to really find value in that to ask for another survey. You know what I mean? Like, that's just another set of information that we're asking. And if we felt that that was really important and that didn't kind of cause any legal concerns.
Yeah, no, I wasn't
We could.
thinking of handling it that way, but on the application, rather than having it be.
Oh, you're saying have it be voluntary on the
Have
application?
it be voluntary on the application.
Yeah, no, I think that there was a legal question and concern around having that information provided as part of an application review process. Yes. Sorry, I misunderstood your question, Chair.
I'm not sure who was next here. Representative Levitt, did you have a hand up?
I did not.
Okay, Representative Templeman.
So some of this data you have collected and aggregated to some degree. You're describing lists of, anonymous and linked to an application. Have there been any more comprehensive reports published with this data that can, that we can look at and be like, oh yeah, there's a clear, disconnect here, or are there any prepared documents like that?
No. So
Okay.
the the applicant information and that anonymous demographic information, we have not currently to date captured that information. That would be something that will start in
Oh,
July.
you don't have it yet?
do not.
Very good.
Yeah, and
Okay.
yeah, right. So we don't have any of that data currently.
Okay.
Representative Rice and then Representative O'Brien.
Another piece that we've been talking about a lot around this is access to capital through traditional means. So it would be if there's a way to ask, you know, in whichever section is more appropriate, sort of have you gotten a loan from a traditional lending source before, or have you been denied for a loan from a traditional lending source? You know, that kind of.
Yeah, we do. Those are interesting questions. We do ask in our current application, have you received a grant from Working Lands before? Have you received funding from another source? Outline those sources. And then in their project, if they want to claim a match funding, they have to identify their match funding sources, if they're secured, or even if they're being sought and currently insecure. So we do have that information,
The
but
piece that's missing, I think that would be interesting from that is.
the traditional lender
Yeah, or particularly have they sought and been denied?
been denied. Yeah.
Traditional lender.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah. And wait, can I just ask one clarifying question, Representative Rice? Would you want to know it as a business or for this project?
Sorry.
Would you want to know if they've been denied traditional
as a
lending
business.
as a business overall? Okay. Great.
Representative O'Brien.
What sort of access does the agency have to that USDA farm census?
Pretty universal. I mean, it's all public.
Like it's by county or
Yes, I think you can break it down by county.
having just filled it out a couple months ago, I mean, it seemed like there's a lot of stuff in there that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we can use the USDA NAS data to tell us lots of things. That doesn't tell us about our applicants though, right? I mean, that just tells us about the agricultural community within the state.
Right.
But yeah, there's a lot of data there that, you know, some of which I'm familiar with and a lot of it I'm probably not very familiar with. But we do, I mean, that's really the data set that we go to when we have questions of like, and there are demographic questions in that data set around agriculture in general in the state. But again, it's not, I didn't think doesn't get to who's seeking support from the agency and then who are we granting those assistance to? It doesn't tell us that, obviously.
Is it anonymous or can you actually?
Yeah, it is anonymous.
Okay, so you can't identify, I mean, you probably could in some ways, but identify certain farms.
Not through the NAS census version that we publicly have access to. I don't know if USDA could do a different
Because they're sending
query.
it to a specific person, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's designed so that you can't do that based upon the public version of the data.
Right.
Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, I want to go back to Representative Rice's question because I'm trying to wrap my head around what this bill is trying to do. And there's two types of, funding in traditional borrowing. And one is acquisition funds to either acquire property, a farm or portion of a farm or land. The other might be for equipment and, one would be they all require collateral. There's a chattel loan for a specific manure spreader or a tractor, but there's a mortgage loan to acquire property. But it all requires, without collateral, I've borrowed hundreds of loans of both types, mostly chattel mortgages as opposed to property mortgages. But without collateral, you can't even get to first base. You get in the door and talk to someone and it ends there. So, and I'm talking, whether it's Farm Credit East, a credit union or a conventional lender. So I bring that up because in trying to help out the heretofore excluded segments of the population that very much have the energy or intent and desire to put it all out without access to capital, I think is that a goal of this bill? Because the working lands, I don't know if the grants are based on collateral, but to get into the business, yeah, you have to have collateral.
Can you address that at all?
I mean, I think I can just respond to it. I think there is a continuum of investment, and I think that traditional lending and grants are on opposite ends of that continuum, right? And there's lots of intersection around risk and return in the middle, along that same continuum. I know that, so one of the things that the Working Lands Program has invested in the past has been in the Vermont Community Loan Fund as an organization that has the Sprout program, which is designed for low or no interest loans for small businesses that aren't well capitalized or collateralized to access a loan to make an improvement or an expansion or a growth in their business. There's similar options through VitaVac that are sort of designed for different scale and different leveraged or businesses with less collateral. We've talked about grants as a way to sort of be a form of improving that ratio of the situation for the applicant, for the business, right? So if they have grant funds, that could make them more successful in a lending application than if they didn't have access to those grant funds, because it's capital towards the business proposal or project that they have in mind.
It could even be a down payment.
It could be,
They may
sure.
want 20% down.
Right. So I'm not, that's why I'm saying I can't quite respond exactly to your point around, many beginning businesses don't have the collateral to be competitive for traditional lending, which is why kind of like the granting option or the low interest loan or these Sprout programs that are very specifically targeting those smaller businesses were created.
Representative.
Just to add a layer onto this, so there are venture capital companies that will give money to agriculture specifically and in general, but specifically to regenerative agriculture without upfront money. So there are opportunities to capture some of the, and most of these are either European or Western United States based companies, but not to say that this doesn't exist or could exist in New England.
And I also think this is where philanthropy also fits in.
level.
Yeah, it's in
Yeah.
that same category of willing to make higher risk investments in a beginning business without expecting return.
Yeah.
This is just a working lands question. Do you have any weights on sort of what percentages you want for agriculture and what for forest economy? Because it's both, right?
It is, yeah, and the board of the directors, or the board, I guess, makes that, I'm trying to decide what word to use, like they make that decision annually when they look at the various funding opportunities. Once we know what our budget is for the program, every summer, the Working Lands board members meet and they have a symposium where they spend time talking about, okay, our budget is X million. How do we want to divide that per funding opportunity? How much do we want to put out for service providers? How much do we want to put out in these large impact grants? How much do we want to put towards business enterprise awards? what are the special conditions we have? You know, maybe we've got the small farm transition piece that we have to carve out, or maybe we also have $1 million of ARPA that has very specific requirements. So the board takes all that information and then they say, okay, we understand the restrictions and the stipulations and the intent behind the funding and the appropriations, and then they divide it out by the different categories, and then they set some targets to say, we'd like to see, you know, more investments in the wood manufacturing or forestry sector in these two funding opportunities because they're not eligible for the primary producer category, for example. So each year it's a different formulation based upon what they have for funding and stipulations and decisions that they can then make based upon the budget. So each year it changes a little bit, but there's a real concerted prioritization towards forestry and wood manufacturing because we don't see as many applications from that sector as we do from the farm and food and ag side. And oftentimes they're larger requests because they're looking for bigger pieces of equipment that are more expensive. And so we try to kind of make sure that when we're looking at the industry impact category of applications that come in, that we fund as many of the competitive forestry ones as we can because they need those bigger pieces of equipment. They are often larger asks, and that's the category that they kind of are more targeted towards. And then in the Working Lands report, which you guys all have a copy of, and I have more copies in the office if you'd like to see them again. If for some reason you didn't have a copy, but there is a chart in here that shows kind of like investments, the distribution of grant funds to businesses per sector since the beginning. So that's what this chart is. It sort of shows you, you know, since 2012, where Working Lands dollars have gone to what sector. And so the largest is to dairy and dairy products, then livestock and meat products, wood manufacturing and construction is the third category, you know, and down. So we also consider that to sort of say, boy, we haven't seen a lot of, we haven't funded a lot of grain crops or maple applications. Let's aim for more of those. But then again, we have to see what we get for applications. And if they are the lowest scoring or the least competitive or, you know, the least desirable project, then they're still not going to get funded, even if they're in a category that we're hoping to see, you know, greater investments in. So it's a balance that the board and the staff and the review team does every year.
With that picture there,
Sorry.
the cheese.
Oh, I know.
In this bill then, you know, it might be this
For
sort of thing where even if there was data,
Is there another hand up? Can you refresh our memories?
Yeah.
Remind us to the board, the staff, you just mentioned the board, the staff and the review team. Is the decisions are ultimately made by the board? Is that the review team, or is the review team a separate group of people?
Yeah, it's a separate and some overlapping members. So each funding opportunity, when it closes, the staff take all the applications and they assign every application to 3 reviewers. So each application gets reviewed 3 times. And the reviewers are a combination of board members, staff, Agency of Ag employees, and industry representatives that don't have a conflict of interest with reviewing the particular applications. That's the first question that a reviewer has to attest to, is that they don't have a conflict of interest. Each application is then reviewed by 3 reviewers. They submit scores, and then there's a review meeting where we go over all the applications. We look at the scores and the comments, and we make a recommendation, slate, we call it, slate recommendation that then goes to the board that says the review committee recommends these be considered for funding, these X number of applications. Then the board receives all the scores, all the reviews, all the summaries, and the slate, and the board has a conversation and discussion about the applications, and they make a decision on what they recommend for funding. And then I think it has to be officially approved by the secretary before those awards are made.
The industry representatives who participate in the reviews, are they do they have a title? Are they somehow Working Lands?
No, it just means they could be someone from the Maple Sugar Makers Association, or it could be a member of UVM Extension, or it could be, a business planner, or it could be a NOFA Vermont employee.
I'm wondering, are they appointed or how do they get to be, and for how long?
Oh, so we just ask them if they are willing to participate in a review of Working Lands grants. And so we have kind of a long list of folks that we ask, and we are really clear about the expectation and the timeline and number of applications they have to review and the meetings that they would attend. And people either say, yes, I can do it this round, or no, I can't fit it in. And so then we keep going, expanding that list and going to, more and more people to ask if they're willing to be grant application reviewers.
And that's,
Are they advisory board members?
No, they're not board members.
And
No.
not advisory board.
Yep.
and the expectation might be do it first for one round for a year and
And then we'll ask you again next year.
again next year, but yeah.
Yeah, we might kind of shift and ask another group of people. It takes, I forget that the staff would know, but I think, depending on how many applications we have, we sometimes need like 50 people to review because you need to do, or 40, I think we had 40 some odd reviewers in this last funding up round because, if each application needs to be reviewed by 3 people, you really.
A finite number of staff and a finite number of board members to participate in any of that. So the more applications, the more outside reviewers you.
Yeah. And so the Working Lands staff are 2 staff plus a portion of a member of our grants and contracts team. So it's like 2 1/4 staff that manage the Working Lands program currently. So it's not a lot of staff on the program itself. When we do grant reviews, we draw on all of the Ag Development Division staff and other program managers and other staff within the agency. So from our Water Quality Division or from our meat inspection, our dairy inspection, we ask as many of the Agency of Ag employees that have a connection to the purpose of these grants to review, as well as don't want it just to be Agency of Agriculture. So we also look to outside partners to engage, as well as board members
Some are former grantees.
who are reviewing. Yeah, they could be. Yep.
I'll just ask one more question and then if there.
I need to.
Be at lunch, aren't we? Yeah.
No, I have.
If we're
Okay.
got to the end of the hour here, but I'm wondering, if you have 3 people who are reviewing each application and they're scoring it, somewhat objective system for scoring, do you tend to see scores that are fairly consistent across 3 different people measuring them?
Depends. So sometimes the scores are very consistent, and other times there's a wide discrepancy. And so when that full list of all the scores of all the applications come in, that's what the staff does, is they say, okay, there's a percentage at the top that are like, everybody gave them a 5, which a 5 would be, do you recommend? And there's a lot of criteria and a lot of questions and a lot of scores, but the score that's really clearly, this is a perfect application to award or to fund. Then there's some at the bottom that are very consistently, 2s, which are like not really well developed enough to be considered, and that's really clear. And then there's a bunch in the middle, and it's usually the ones in the middle that we talk the most about. And it could be that one application got a 5, a 3, and a 2. So we look at those, we find those, and we spend a lot of time talking about those. Why did that reviewer give them a 5? Why did that reviewer give them a 2? Was there a misunderstanding, or did someone know something about the application that others missed? And so those areas where we, again, have the discrepancy usually place applications in the middle. Also in the middle are those that consistently got a 3. Everybody, 3 scores, 3 reviewers gave them a score of 3. And that, generally is another application that we talk about, that it's like, yeah, it's okay. Didn't rise to the top. It certainly didn't sink to the bottom. Let's talk this through. What's the industry? Have they been a previous grantee? Where are they located? Like, are they in a county that we haven't seen an application or a grant from in 4 years? Like, let's consider them a little bit higher. So yeah, those are many of the conversations that we have.
Well, If there are any other questions, we'll hold them. Thanks for that perspective on this bill.
Yeah, welcome.
Everybody good for the moment?